1. Theoretical definition of nuclear deterrence and asymmetric escalation. In classical deterrence theory, nuclear deterrence is defined not merely as the possession of weapons, but as a structure that instills the belief in the existence of a retaliatory capability sufficient to inflict unbearable damage upon an adversary's core values. Brody 1959. Schelling 1966. TNWs have historically been positioned as auxiliary means backed by the ultimate escalation dominance of strategic nuclear forces. Therefore, the operation of TNWs without strategic backing introduces a specific asymmetry into the deterrence structure. 1.1 The nature of asymmetry. While the use of TNWs establishes a precedent for nuclear use, if the state lacks an equivalent capability to retaliate against the adversary's core, a structure emerges where the initiative for escalation shifts to the adversary. Although actual decision-making depends on the international environment, domestic politics, and third-party intervention, in deterrence theory, leaving room for the adversary to choose the worst-case option is itself positioned as a destabilizing factor. Jervis 1989. 2. Tactical nuclear doctrine and geographic conditions. 2.1 Prerequisites. In continental states, TNWs have been conceived and operated based on geographic conditions that allow for broad land theaters, buffer zones distant from the national center, and the partial abandonment of contaminated areas. Pakistan's tactical nuclear weapon, Nasser, in South Asia is often cited as a case of deterrence lacking strategic depth. However, its nuclear doctrine assumes land invasion as the primary scenario, placing maritime warfare outside the scope of nuclear application. This case should not be interpreted as evidence of the versatility of TNWs, but rather as supporting evidence that TNWs are a weapon system heavily dependent on specific geographic conditions. 3. Limits of the battlefield and uses in maritime states. For insular states, the externalization of the battlefield assumed by continental states is difficult. The theaters where TNWs are expected to be used tend to overlap with territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, EEZs, major ports, and sea lines of communication, SLOCs. 3.1 Reinterpreting Mearsheimer's stopping power of water and self-blockade in offensive realism. John Mearsheimer discussed the stopping power of water, which inhibits power projection. Mearsheimer 2001. Originally, this referred to the ocean as a barrier making invasion difficult. However, for a maritime state using nuclear weapons within its own seas, this logic applies inversely. That is, radioactively contaminated waters become a wall of self-blockade that, while hindering enemy invasion, simultaneously severs the nation's own access to SLOCs and fishery resources. For import-dependent maritime states, this self-induced loss of maritime function produces an economic asphyxiation effect equivalent to a naval blockade by an enemy. This suggests a paradox, self-induced vulnerability, where nuclear use, beyond defense purposes, undermines the very foundation of national survival. 4. Institutional limits of nuclear sharing. In NATO-style nuclear sharing, what is shared is limited to non-strategic nuclear weapons, and the authority to use them remains with a nuclear-possessing state. There is no precedent for entrusting the ultimate authority to use strategic nuclear weapons to another country. Therefore, while nuclear sharing may hold certain significance as a political signal, it does not grant the shared state strategic autonomy or the initiative in escalation management. 5. Response to anticipated counter-arguments. 5.1 Limited nuclear deterrence and uncertainty of signaling at sea. Limited nuclear deterrence theory argues that by limiting nuclear use to specific theaters or targets, invasion costs can be made uncertain, potentially avoiding total nuclear war. However, for this theory to hold, the intent of use, the signal, must be accurately conveyed to the adversary. While nuclear explosions on land have relatively clear impact points and damage radii, nuclear explosions at sea or underwater involve highly fluid shockwave propagation and contaminated water dispersion. Additionally, on the high seas, there is a high risk of unintended damage to third-party vessels. Consequently, The risk that the use of TNWs at sea will be misidentified not as a limited political demonstration but as an indiscriminate attack or a prelude to total war is significantly higher than on land. Combined with the asymmetry of escalation perception, this points to the possibility of triggering uncontrollable retaliatory exchanges. 5.2 Graduated escalation. Graduated deterrence assumes the existence of options corresponding to each rung of the escalation ladder. However, for states lacking strategic nukes, the upper rungs are structurally missing, making the ladder not a reversible stage but a one-way path to destruction. 6. Conclusion. This paper does not deny the possibility that TNWs and nuclear sharing may complement deterrence under specific conditions. However, under the geographic conditions of a maritime state, these options are highly likely to reduce stability and structurally amplify national vulnerability. The issue is not the binary of whether to possess nuclear weapons or not, but what consequences specific nuclear forces bring about under specific geographic and strategic conditions. Appendix A. Anticipated peer review comments and summaries of rebuttals. Anticipated comment 1. Does this paper underestimate the effectiveness of limited nuclear deterrence? Summary of response. This paper does not deny the theoretical possibility of limited nuclear deterrence per se. Instead, it structurally demonstrates that the conditions required for its success are difficult to fulfill in maritime states. Anticipated comment 2. The paper treats the adversary's behavior deterministically. Summary of response. While acknowledging the uncertainty of decision-making, the paper emphasizes that the very existence of a situation where the worst-case option remains available is a factor contributing to deterrence instability. Appendix B. Anticipated peer review comments and rebuttals. Extended. Comment B1. This paper places too much emphasis on the risks of tactical nuclear weapons and does not sufficiently consider alternative policy measures such as strengthening conventional forces, missile defense, or extended deterrence. Summary of response. The purpose of this paper is not to present an optimal solution for a comprehensive defense policy, but is limited to analyzing what structural consequences specific nuclear postures, tactical nuclear weapons and nuclear sharing, bring about under specific geographic conditions, maritime states. Conventional forces, missile defense, and extended deterrence are all important policy options, but they belong to a different analytical dimension than the escalation structure associated with nuclear use analyzed in this paper. The paper intends to make a theoretical contribution focusing on the structural stability of nuclear deterrence, rather than the comprehensiveness of the policy menu. Comment B2. The premise that an adversary will always choose the maximum level of retaliation is unrealistic. Is it not possible that restraint would function in an actual crisis? Summary of response. This paper does not deterministically assume the adversary's actions. As explicitly stated in the text, actual decision-making is influenced by the international environment, domestic politics, and third-party intervention. However, what is crucial in deterrence theory is the instability caused by the very situation where the worst-case option has not been excluded. Jervis 1989. The use of tactical nuclear weapons by a state lacking strategic retaliatory capability creates a structure that surrenders the initiative in escalation to the adversary. The issue lies in creating a state where maximum retaliation remains a rational option for the opponent. Comment B3. Are you underestimating the possibility of controlling escalation through limited nuclear deterrence or demonstration use? Summary of response. This paper does not deny the theoretical possibility of limited nuclear deterrence. Rather, it specifies the prerequisites for limited nuclear deterrence to function: limitation of the battlefield, unambiguous signaling of intent, and shared perception of escalation, and points out that these conditions are structurally difficult to meet in maritime states. In particular, nuclear use in the maritime domain carries a significantly higher risk than in land theaters of being misidentified not as a limited political signal but as an indiscriminate attack or prelude to total war, due to the low visibility of damage scope and intent, as well as the high risk of collateral damage to third parties. Comment before. Other maritime states, such as the UK and France, maintain nuclear deterrence. Isn't the argument of this paper an overgeneralization? Summary of response: this paper does not discuss maritime states as a monolithic group but explicitly sets the condition of maritime states that do not possess strategic nuclear weapons. Both the UK and France possess autonomous strategic nuclear forces, SSBNs, which differs from the analytical conditions of this paper. Therefore, the argument of this paper is limited in its application to cases, such as Japan, where a nation relies on tactical nuclear weapons or nuclear sharing while lacking strategic nuclear capabilities. Comment B5. Can Pakistan's tactical nuclear weapon, Nasser, not be interpreted as a successful example of deterrence lacking strategic nuclear weapons? Summary of response: the case of Pakistan should be interpreted as a subsidiary example indicating that tactical nuclear weapons are a weapons system dependent on specific geographic and strategic conditions, rather than as general evidence of their effectiveness. Pakistan's nuclear doctrine assumes land invasion as the primary scenario and does not apply nuclear use to maritime warfare or ease defense. In this respect, the conditions differ fundamentally from the geographic constraints faced by maritime states. Comment B6. Doesn't nuclear sharing have a certain effect as a political deterrence signal? Summary of response: this paper does not deny the possibility that nuclear sharing emits a political or symbolic deterrence signal. However, even in NATO-style nuclear sharing, the ultimate authority to use strategic nuclear weapons remains with a nuclear-armed state, and the non-nuclear partner does not hold the initiative in escalation management. Consequently, the paper problematizes the point that while nuclear sharing may increase the signal strength of deterrence, it may fixate a structure where the sharing nation undertakes battlefield risks without resolving the strategic asymmetry. Comment B7. What are the policy implications of this paper? The conclusion appears somewhat passive. Summary of response: the primary contribution of this paper lies in visualizing the structural risks associated with policy choices, rather than recommending specific policies. The policy significance of this paper lies in theoretically demonstrating that arguments treating tactical nuclear weapons or nuclear sharing as intermediate and realistic options may, depending on geographic conditions, actually undermine the stability of a deterrence.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a deep structural look at strategic choices, specifically for nations that live by the sea. Our source material today really zeroes in on this fascinating dilemma. What happens when a maritime state, often an island nation, finds it politically or just institutionally impossible to get its hands on strategic nuclear weapons?
They look for other options, ways to make up for it. And the two most common pathways they explore are tactical nuclear weapons, or TNW, and nuclear sharing agreements with a major ally.
Right.
But the core argument we're drawing out of these sources is, well, it's pretty provocative.
Which is?
That instead of making deterrence more stable, these alternatives, the TNW or the nuclear sharing, might actually, structurally, increase the risk of escalation and national vulnerability, too.
Particularly for these island nations we're talking about.
Exactly, because of their unique geography.
Okay, so let's be absolutely clear on the mission here before we go any further. This deep dive is not an argument for or against any nation having strategic nuclear weapons. We are completely sidestepping that whole debate.
Exactly. This is a structural analysis. Our whole mission is to clarify the geopolitical, the strategic consequences that pop up, specifically when a state relies on these other options, TNW or nuclear sharing, but without having that top-tier strategic retaliatory capability.
So it's about what the strategy looks like when you only hold the middle rung of the escalation ladder, but not the top one.
That's a great way to put it.
So the key question for us is, what happens when geography and the specific limitations of certain weapon systems just completely clash in the highest stakes world of defense doctrine?
Yeah.
Let's jump right in at the foundation then. Let's start with the classical definition of nuclear deterrence.
Okay, so if we go back to the foundational thinking, the ideas laid out by Brody and Schelling way back in the mid-20th century deterrence is so much more than just owning a weapon. It's about making sure your adversary fundamentally believes that you have the capacity and the will to inflict just intolerable, catastrophic damage on their most vital centers. That's the retaliatory capability you need.
It's the assurance that if they hit your capital, you can hit theirs. Simple as that. It's that ultimate escalation ceiling that makes the whole terrifying strategy work.
And that ceiling is absolutely essential for stability. Historically, tactical nuclear weapons were designed as, well, exactly what their name suggests, tactical tools
For the battlefield.
for the battlefield, the lower rungs on that escalation ladder. But, and this is critical, they were always, in both U.S. and Soviet doctrine, backed up by the ultimate threat, the big strategic nuclear forces.
But if you take away that strategic ceiling, the whole equation just gets thrown out of whack. You're introducing a massive asymmetry.
Absolutely. Think about what happens. A state uses a TNW, right? So they've now set a precedent for using nuclear weapons, but they don't have that ability to hit back at the enemy's homeland in a catastrophic way.
So they've just given up a huge advantage.
A massive one. You've just transferred what the source material calls the escalation leadership directly to your enemy.
Okay, let's unpack that phrase, escalation leadership. What does that mean in practical terms for someone trying to understand this?
It means the adversary holds all the cards. They get to decide what happens next. They can respond conventionally, or they could dramatically escalate to a strategic threat of their own. Or they can just use your own TNW attack as political leverage against you.
Because you've shown you're willing to go nuclear.
You've shown you're willing to go nuclear, but you've given them the final say on how far up that ladder things go, and they don't have to fear a proportional existential strike in return.
Because they still hold the ultimate ace. They can wipe you out, and you can't do the
Right.
same back to them.
Precisely. And scholars like Robert Jervis have explored this. While, real-world crises are messy and complicated, the mere fact that the adversary structurally holds the option for the absolute worst-case scenario for you is, in itself, a huge destabilizing factor.
So it's the structural imbalance that matters most.
It really is, regardless of what anyone intends in the moment. The second you fire a TNW without that strategic backup, you are in a strategically terrible position.
You've accepted all the risks of using the weapon, but you've gained none of the ultimate strategic leverage. That brings us neatly to geography, because TNWs were never meant to be used just anywhere.
No, not at all. The historical playbook for TNW doctrine was written by and for continental states. The preconditions were very, very specific.
Like what?
Well, you needed vast land battlefields. You needed buffer zones, think Eastern Europe during the Cold War, that were far away from your own command centers. And crucially, you needed the ability to partially abandon or accept contamination in some remote areas without it paralyzing your entire nation.
So you could externalize the battlefield. You could fight it out in the borderlands, far from your own economic and political heartland.
That ability to externalize is the key, the defining feature. You had geographical depth, so you could tolerate some contamination.
Now, we often hear the Pakistan example brought up their short-range TNW system, the Nasser. It's cited as a success story of using battlefield nukes for deterrence without huge strategic backing. But the sources we're looking at argue this interpretation is, well, it's pretty misleading if you try to apply it everywhere.
It is, because the Pakistan doctrine, as analysts have detailed, is designed for a very specific land invasion by a much larger conventional army. And crucially, the sources point out that their nuclear doctrine generally puts maritime warfare completely outside the scope of nuclear use.
Wait a second. So if their own TNW doctrine explicitly says we won't use these at sea, that just confirms that this weapon system is deeply dependent on specific land-based geography.
It's designed to stop tanks, not ships.
It's a land-based deterrent for a land-based threat. And this right here sets up the structural paradox for any island or maritime nation that tries to go down this path.
Yes. If they choose TNWs, they can't assume any of those same geographical buffers will apply. In fact, the complete opposite happens.
And this is where we get to the core of it. The maritime paradox. Unlike a continental state, a maritime nation can't just externalize the battlefield. The sea is their lifeline.
And what's truly fascinating and terrifying is the physical overlap. The defensive zones where you'd want to stop an invasion, your territorial waters, your exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, these are the exact same places where your major ports are, your fishing grounds, your vital sea lanes of communication, your SLOCs.
So your defensive action happens right on your own doorstep. If you use a TNW to stop an invasion fleet, you are literally contaminating your own front yard.
And this is the great inversion we have to think about. Mearheimer's classic theory talks about the stopping power of water. Right? The idea that the sea acts as this great defensive barrier that protects you.
It makes an invasion really hard.
It does. But for a maritime state that uses a nuclear weapon inside its own EEZ, that logic gets turned completely on its head. Instead of stopping the enemy, the nuclear use creates what the sources call the self-blockade phenomenon.
A self-blockade. Wow. That is an incredibly powerful and, frankly, terrifying term. How does that work?
The radioactive contamination from using a TNW in those crucial coastal waters, it forms an impenetrable barrier. And yes, it successfully blocks the enemy. You achieve your tactical goal, but it simultaneously cuts off your own nation's access to its essential maritime functions.
Which means blocking your own major shipping routes, making your key ports unusable, destroying your fishing stocks, potentially for decades.
Precisely. We're talking about massive economic asphyxiation. For a highly import-dependent maritime state, which might rely on those sea lanes for, say, 90% of its energy and food, this self-induced loss of marine function is the same as a successful enemy naval blockade.
Except you did it to yourself.
You did it to yourself, and the enemy never even had to fire a conventional shot. The cure becomes the disease, but with this horrifying strategic twist. You stop the invasion, congratulations. But in the process, you committed economic suicide. Who is going to insure a vessel trying to dock at a port near a radioactive plume?
No one. Global shipping firms would reroute instantly. Insurance would be impossible. The international community, fearing contaminated cargo, would effectively boycott those sea lanes. It's this paradox where the very act of physical defense destroys your own basis for survival.
That's self-induced vulnerability right there.
And that structural limit feels like the key takeaway for maritime states thinking about TNWs. The weapon system itself is just geographically incompatible with their survival strategy.
It is.
Okay, so let's pivot to that second option, nuclear sharing. This sounds, on the surface, like a great workaround. You get the deterrent umbrella without all the cost and hassle of developing the warhead yourself. But what are the institutional limits?
Well, the limits are baked right into the agreements. If you look at the NATO model for nuclear sharing, it only ever involves non-strategic weapons. And, fundamentally, the nation that owns the nukes, the U.S., in NATO's case, always retains final authority over their use.
So sharing doesn't actually give the non-nuclear state any real control?
Not over the strategic process, no. The source material is very clear on this. Sharing does not grant strategic autonomy. You can't guarantee that the ultimate retaliatory strike will be used on your behalf if things really go south.
So the sharing state takes on huge risks, like maybe even hosting these weapons on its own soil.
Massive battlefield risk, yes.
Without getting any real control over the strategic off-ramp or on-ramp, it basically locks in that same structural asymmetry we were just talking about.
It does. It reinforces it. You absorb the risk, but you don't get the strategic control.
And this ties right back into the theory of limited nuclear deterrence, the idea that you can, limit nuclear use to specific targets to avoid an all-out war. But that whole theory depends on one thing.
On the signal being received correctly.
Okay.
On your intended message of restraint being accurately understood by a high-stress adversary.
And this is where the sea itself becomes a huge problem. What the sources call signaling failure at sea.
Mm-hmm.
Why is the sea such a bad environment for signaling compared to land?
Well, because on land, things are relatively clear. The conflict zone, the damage radius, the geographical limits, it's all pretty contained. You hit a border unit, that's a signal. But at sea or underwater, the context is just completely fluid and uncontrollable.
The physics change everything.
They really do. The way shock waves propagate, the unpredictable way that radioactive water contamination spreads, it can travel hundreds of miles from the blast, and the fluid boundaries just make precise, limited control almost impossible. And on top of that, there's a huge risk of hitting some unintended third-party vessel out on the high seas.
Right. You fire what you think is a warning shot, but the plume and the shock wave get carried by the currents. Suddenly you've contaminated an international fishing fleet or knocked out a cargo ship from a neutral country. That's not a limited signal, that's global chaos.
Exactly. The intended message, hey, this is a limited political demonstration, not an escalation to total war, it gets completely garbled in the noise. Yeah. And because of that fluid nature, using a TNW at sea has a much, much higher chance of being misinterpreted by your adversary as an indiscriminate all-out attack.
So you fire a low-level shot, but the enemy sees it as a full-scale strategic threat. And that non-symmetry in perception just skyrockets the chances of an uncontrollable retaliatory spiral that you, the TNW user, have no strategic way to stop.
And that's it. The institutional limits of the sharing agreement combined with the geographical limits of trying to send a clear signal at sea, They both reinforce the exact same structural vulnerability. You lack control over the ultimate strategic outcome.
So let's bring this all together. We've covered the classical asymmetry, the geographical straitjacket of TNW doctrine, the catastrophic self-blockade paradox for island nations, and these institutional limits of nuclear sharing and signaling failure at sea.
Yeah, and the central finding here is really clear. The source material acknowledges that, okay, TNW or nuclear sharing might complement deterrence in certain situations, mainly for continental states with lots of land. But under the structural constraints of a maritime state that doesn't have its own strategic backup, these options are functionally likely to decrease stability and amplify national vulnerability.
So the analysis moves beyond that simple political question of, nukes or no nukes. The crucial takeaway here for you, the listener, is to understand the structural consequences that specific force structures create when they clash with immutable geographic reality. The structure itself is the destabilizing factor.
It's the worst-case structural outcome that has to inform policy, not just the best-case tactical one.
This has profound implications for anyone advising a maritime state on their defense planning. So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought to explore on your own. If a nation cannot guarantee that its own defensive nuclear action won't immediately lead to its own economic strangulation, that self-blockade, how does that fundamentally redefine the purpose and efficacy of its entire defense strategy?
Right.
Is that strategy really about defense anymore, or is it just a different, maybe slower form of self-assured destruction, something to consider as you navigate the complexities of strategic deterrence?